Hello. In this video, we're going to go over how we can manage form input in interactive React applications. So in particular, our example is that we're going to make it so that we have a form where we can submit this in order to add additional songs to a list of songs that we're creating interactively. You may recall this demo from a previous video when we did this using DOM level interaction. Now we're going to do it in React. All right. So what we've got to start out with is we have an app that is a song list that lists out our songs. We have an array to keep track of a bunch of objects, each object representing a song we want to display. We are able to take that array, map it into an array of li elements, and then we render those li elements on the screen in order to show the list of songs. We're also then able to render an add song form, which is a distinct component designed to just be the whole form itself. This form is complex enough, there's enough things going on here that it didn't make sense for it to be part of the list. It's its own component to do its own set of work. All right, now if we want to be able to update this array of songs, the first thing we're going to need to do is to make sure this array is part of our state, that it's data that's being tracked and it can change over time. So as a brief review of state, let's go through how this works. All right, this is our brief review of state and state hooks. Now, in order to make it so this data can change over time, we're going to start by importing the state hook function from React. So we're going to import useState. And then when our component is first rendered, right, when we're rendering our song list, we're going to specify we want to use state. We want to call that function in order to set up a state variable that can change over time. So in this case, we're going to call useState. The argument that goes inside here is going to be what do we want our initial data to be? Well, we want this thing to be our initial data. So I'm actually going to just rename that. I'm going to call this the initial data. All right. And I'm going to take the initial data and I'm going to go move it sort of up here. I'm actually move it outside of this. We're going to sort of, because it's a constant. Actually, I don't want to sell that. We're going to put it, we'll just put it here at the top of the function, right? That's our initial data. Our use state will be based on that initial data, right? That's what we're starting out as. Now remember that whenever we call useState, this returns an array of 2 elements. So the first one is going to be our state variable. In this case, I'm going to call it song array because that's what I've been using throughout the rest of my code. And then of course, the second argument is the setter for that. So this would be called set song array. Great. And that's now going to let us be able to update what our component, what is inside of our state data. We can change and modify and add new elements to this. Let's actually go ahead and get that set up now while we're further thinking about it. So I'm going to need to I want to be able to add a new song to this array. So I'm actually going to make myself a helper function, sort of an assisting function that's going to let me be able to do that work. So I'm going to find myself a new function called, how about add song, that can take in an artist, artist, a title, and a URL. Right, so this is, I'm sorry, this is going to be a function. Right, so I'm going to find myself a function that let me take in 3 strings, artist, title, and URL, and will let me add this new element to my song array. Sure, let's do that. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and create my, so we're going to make a new song object, which again is just going to be a new object. So his artist is going to be whatever this artist is. Title will be whatever the title is. And the YouTube URL is going to be whatever this URL is. So that creates my new object. I'm then going to say, go ahead and create my new, I'm going to create my sort of my updated version of my song array. So we call this the updated song array. It's going to be my old song array's elements, and I'm going to use my spreading operator plus my new song element, my new song object. So this creates basically a new copy of the song array. And with that new copy, I can then set that to become my state, right? So I can set my song array. So I can call set song array to now be my updated song array. And this will then, of course, update the state and re-render. So with that in place, we're able to, that function, if I ever call add song, that will go ahead and let me be able to update my components and be able to actually show new content in my state. Great. That's in place. We're going to come back to this function in a moment. Because what we first now need to do in order to get the artist, the title, and the URL, we need to get that information from the form, which means we need to start looking at my song form to figure out how to do that. Now, oh, great. Other notes. See, I got through. I'm not writing my slides. So the reason that I'm making a copy here, that I'm making a copy of the song array, is because if I just try to append or push that new value into this existing array, then the array itself isn't different. Its content is different, but the array itself is the exact same object. So if I then say React, your state is now different. Here's an object. React will look at it and says, that's the exact same array you had before. React doesn't know to look inside the array to go see that it has a different number of elements, or those elements have different content inside of them, or those things have different side of them. Like React can't go digging into the depths of a complex data structure. So React just says, oh, that's the same array, and it doesn't update anything. Nothing ever changes. So what this means is that whenever you want to update an object or an array that's inside of your state, right? If your state is going to be an array or it's going to be an object, you need to create a new copy, a brand new object or a brand new array, generally by copying it and like copying all the elements over inside of it. That tends to be the easiest way of making that work better. There's some ways we can actually break apart each individual piece. But that's kind of the approach we want to make sure to take. So this is going to make it so that when you actually update your data, React will be able to respond to that new updated data. Because again, if you just try to push into the same array, React will see that as being just the same array, and therefore nothing has changed. And so React won't re-render anything because nothing has changed. All right, now we can actually think more about getting our artist title and URL, which we can get from our form. Now, the way that we manage forms in React is we use what are called a controlled form. So forms in HTML, right? If I try to type in a name, right, the Beatles here, right, that data is being shown on display. And look, it changes, right? That is in many ways, it almost feels interactive. That's because HTML, not React, but HTML itself is actually keeping track of the state of what's inside that input element, right? It's keeping track of that information. The problem is that we don't want to be relying on having React keeping track of some information and then HTML keeping track of information, because again, that's violating our do not repeat ourselves principle and means that we now have two different pieces of information that might be in conflict, right? We make it conflicts between those. So what we do instead is we make it so that React is the one who keeps track of and manages all the data in our inputs. We're going to have React micromanage HTML, in fact. So React is going to keep track of all the values inside that state and then tell HTML what value it's allowed to show on the screen. And we're going to do that by using two different props that we have to add to our inputs. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and actually create a new variable. We're going to make it a state variable that's going to be our values we're keeping track of. So it's going to be our artist value. And we'll set artist value by calling use state, and this is going to be what we want our artist to be. I want to use state, so I need to make sure to import use state. React up here. Then in my input for the artist, which is right here, and it's a little bit hard to see in all the HTML, right? There's my input for my artist. What I'm going to do is I'm going to specify that this thing's value, right? The actual value that it's displaying is going to be whatever that artist value is. So what I'm basically doing is I'm having React tell HTML, this is the content of your input. Your content of your input is whatever value is currently in my state. Whatever value I get from the state scratchboard, that's what you put inside your input. What you'll see that does here, and we'll go over the fact that it's going to is at the moment, now it makes it so that even as I type, nothing can go in there because React is saying, nope, your value is always this blank element. But if I actually want to type something in, we do want to be able to respond to that. So we're going to add another property here called onChange. OnChange is going to respond to change events, which are going to be events that occur when we try to change the content of that input. We're not responding to typing events, because if someone's trying to copy and paste the mouse, that won't be a typing event. If someone's trying to speak to it using because they're through accessibility reasons, so they're trying to use some kind of speech to text kind of system because they can't type, that also may not be typing elements. So we're going to use change events. It's going to handle any way that input's value might get changed. This is an onChange, which means we want a function for us to be able to respond to that changing happening. So in this case, we can do a const handle artist change. It's gonna get a little bit tedious, which I apologize, but right. And that's gonna be my changing function. So when this gets changed, this will be handle artist change. In that event, right, when I try to type something in, I get this event that actually will keep track of what value I tried to type in. And I can access that through that event's value, that event's target's value. So the event.target, that's the element that caused this event, in which case that's my input that caused my event. The value is the value element, value is the value of that input. And what happens, we're going to get the value the user tried to type in sort of before React says, no, don't actually change what's being rendered, right? So it always looks the same way, but React is still going to let us keep track of what the user typed in. So what you'll then notice is that in my input here, right, if I try typing in a value like an A, B, C, D, E, it's going to be able to keep track of what was the thing, register what I typed in along the way. Based on that, now that we know what value the user typed in, we can now take that value the user typed in and save that into my state by calling my state setter function. So we can set my state variable here to be whatever the user typed in. Well, it's going to set that thing directly. So now what ends up happening is that now I can type in the Beatles, and you'll notice it types it in correctly. And at the same time, that word, that text, the Beatles, is being saved inside my artist value state variable, which means that I can access whatever value the user's typed into that input from anywhere in my React application, right? Because it's just a state variable, which means I can now be able to access it locally. I can be able to do a bunch of stuff with it. I can change what I want to see. You know, I can put if statements to say, if you put the Beatles, that's great. I can do any kind of thing I want. So that would let us be able to handle that kind of information. This is called doing a controlled form, because React is controlling the input to that form. There's two parts to this. There's setting up the value to always display some state variable, and then there's setting up an event handler to respond to any changes and save those in your state variable. Controlled forms are how we manage these things. Again, it's micromanaging it, but it's how we can use React to let it keep track of and deal with whatever information is being stored across your inputs. All forms in React in the context for this course should and must be controlled. You do not ever try to rely directly on HTML elements or state directly. Always control all of your forms, and that way it'll let you be able to track and manipulate and work with these forms in a much cleaner, much more effective way. Okay, it does mean that for complex forms with lots of inputs, this can get slightly tedious and a little bit redundant, and that's not necessarily a problem, but it does require a little bit of copying and pasting. So for example, if we want to keep track of the artist and the title, I need to create two different state variables for that, probably. And I want to create multiple different handlers. This is the easiest way. I mean, this is the sort of the most straightforward way of handling these pieces. Right, it's just doing the same thing a couple of times. I can actually copy paste this guy in here into this input. I want to make sure I can get both artist and title. All right, so copy that into both inputs. Check our form. The Beatles, Hard Day's Night, all works the way we expect. YouTube link doesn't work yet. I'm going to type that one in. So that is one way of handling it. Again, you just can keep track of multiple state variables. We're allowed to have lots of different state variables. You can have multiple different event handlers. You're allowed to have multiple event handlers. That's fine. It is possible to have a single state variable that keeps track of all three values, all three strings. It's generally considered better practice to have more state variables than one complex state variable, just because that way you can update. You only have to update one or the other. And don't worry about things getting lost. That tends to work a lot better. There are cool tricks we could use, for example, to make it so that all these events have the same event handler. And then we can use things like accessing the event target's name to determine what state variable we're actually trying to manipulate. So there are ways of sort of combining this and making the code more concise, but I would recommend to start off with just being very broad, even slightly repetitive around forms, just to make sure that you're able to keep track of all the different bugs and all the different issues they might have. This is also important for things like if you want to handle these things differently, right? If one of these are numbers and one of them is a string, or one of them has character limits, or one of them has sort of restricted text you're allowed to use, it lets you be able to handle those things separately from each other so you can keep those things real. That's how we can then control forms and handle them to make sure they're doing their work. So we're now able to keep track of the artist and the title, which means we can now be able to respond to when the form gets submitted. So I have my add song button down here is a submit button that will submit my form. So in my form itself, I can add another event handler, and on submit event handler to say what do I want to do when the form is submitted, however that might occur, hitting enter, hitting the button, or in different ways. So we can add ourselves another event handler. Handle submit is an event. First thing, of course, we're going to need to do is we're going to need to prevent defaults to make sure that my form doesn't cause my page to reload. And now what did I do wrong? Oh, forgot to actually write the handle submit in here. There we go. From there, because I've saved what the current user has typed in as the artist and has typed in as the title, I can access those local variables from this function, right? I don't have to go to this function and try to then say, okay, from the form submission, go into the input. I don't have to talk about, I don't have to know, like this form submission doesn't have to know about their inputs at all. It just looks at my state variables. So it can do something like we're going to say, submitting artist title, right? We'll say we want to submit those three things. Oh, sorry. Artist value, title value. Right. So then if I put the Beatles, Hard Day's Night, right? If I go to submit, it says submitting the Beatles Hard Day's Night, and we're ready to go. And we can even, of course, do other really cool things as well, where I could even set this to back to being blank. So I can make it so that after you submit your artist and title, because all those things are controlled, I can modify them from places that are other places, like when the form is handled. So I can now make it so that when I say the Beatles, Hard Day's Night, it clears the form and we're ready to go. All right, cool. So we've got our form in place, right? We're able to control our inputs and keep track of what the user's typed in. And I've now made it so that when I submit the form, I have a function that runs, I've got some code that executes, and I'm ready to go ahead and submit those values. Now here's the trick, second trick. So I want to be able to add a new song to my song list, right? And I have a function that lets me do that. Add song, right? That's a function here. So I want to call this add song, and I can pass it a title, and an artist title and URL. Great. So let's do that. We can call add song, artist value, title value. I don't have a URL value, so we'll just leave that blank for the moment. Okay. Notice that when I try to do that, I get an error. Add song is not defined. That's because the add song function exists inside of this module, this component, this module, the song list. The form itself doesn't have the add song function. That add song function is in here. I can't move the add song function into the form because the add song function needs to call the state setting variable, and the state setting variable needs to go alongside state, which is needed to get actually rendering the array of elements. So I can't just call the add song directly. This form needs to know which function do I call, right? What is this add song function? It needs to know which function do I call to add a song, right? It needs to know that. The way that we can tell the add song form function the add song form, what function to use is by passing it as a prop. So remember that props that we're able to, that's how we pass data down between components. Props are allowed to be functions. They're not just strings or numbers or even objects or arrays. They can be functions at the same time. So my song list here, when my song list renders an add song form, right? The list says, here's my list. Oh, and here's the form to update them. I can also pass it in an additional prop. I can say, hey, song form, here is maybe the how to add song function, right? You want to know what things to do? Here's a function you can use. This function is add song. I'm passing it to you as a callback. I'm literally taking the instructions on how to add a song and I'm handing them over to that form. And I'm calling that function how to add a song function. That's the name of the prop. So that then in my add song form, remember that we can expand that prop. I can get the how to add song function by destructuring my props. Right, this is, remember, destructuring. I can destructure that function in order to gain access to it, how to add a song function, so that then down here, I can call the how to add a song function. Because my parent, right, the song list gave, as like an inheritance, it gave the add song form the instructions, right, the family recipe for adding new songs, so that then when I'm ready to add a song, I can simply call that family instruction function, which adds the song. And because that function knows how to do things like update my state, it updates my state, which then causes my entire component to re-render and shows me the new songs along the way. So that lets our function be able to, our form be able to work. So that I can now have the Beatles, not the Beatles, and I can have Hard Day's Night, and I can click add song, and my new song shows up. There's no URL yet because we haven't handled URLs, but that's why I can add new songs into my form. And I can keep doing that. I can do the Beatles and Yellow Submarine. I don't know, I got the Beatles on the mind, sure. I keep adding new songs to my form. And ta-da, in which case now we have, again, an interactive page where the user can submit some information, and that information shows up in my list. This is not persisted. If I refresh the page, we go back to initial starting state, which is my initial 3 songs. We'll learn how to do persistence later, but for now, it's fine if, like, when you hit refresh, the whole thing goes away. But the key to remember here is that we are able to update state variables in another component if we have passed down the function that says how to do that. Importantly, notice I'm passing in this add song function, this wrapping function. I'm not passing in the state setter directly. This is considered good defensive programming. It follows what's called Demeter's law, or called the principle of least knowledge, where the idea is that I don't want to handle, like, I don't want to hand access to the entire array, direct access to that, to this other component. I know it's code that I wrote, and like that's not necessarily a problem, but it's considered good, like, practice to not literally hand over access to your wallet to somebody else, right? It's better to be like, I'm going to hand you a function that lets you tell me what you want me to put inside my wallet. I'm not giving my wallet to you to update. I'm saying I'm giving you a function that lets you tell me what you want. That lets me do things like put validation steps in here, right? I can make sure that when someone calls add song, they're not adding a song that already exists, right? I can add some logic around that. It means that I can basically be able to, I can create a good definition where I can say, literally give me these 3 strings. Don't need to worry about creating an object or anything. You don't need to worry about trying to update the existing array in order to make this all happen. You can just give me the data and I will do that work. So don't pass down state setters directly. Always create some wrapping function to do that work. Even if that wrapping function is literally just calling your state setter, still always pass down something. So always pass down this wrapper in order to help keep your sort of code more modularized and better contained and produce sort of a better style and better architecture. Okay. Otherwise, yeah, the fact we can pass down callbacks, pass down functions, lets us be able to access, effectively modify, manipulate, and work with the state from other components, even inside of their children. At the same time, it's possible that we actually want to be able to have components that are siblings be able to share and work with the same kind of data, the same kind of state. So at the moment, add song form is a child of song list, but it's inside the song list component. But you can imagine we want to have these 2 things be side by side instead, right? They are children. So maybe the app, where'd the app go? Maybe instead of having the app render the song list, the app wants to render the song list and the form next to each other because it wants to be able to reorganize how those things are structured. We can still use the fact that we can pass down state or pass down props in order to be able to manage that kind of thing to work. And we do that through what is called lifting up state. So the general idea is that we actually have 2 sibling elements where one of them has some state data and the other one needs access to that because it needs to know what that data is in order for its own rendering or for its own behavior. What we often might end up doing is we actually might end up moving the state. right? I might end up saying, you know what? It turns out that the song list can't be the one who keeps track of the song array. I have to take this song array and all this definitional work and move it up a step, move it into the parent. It's almost like, again, if you have like two kids and they're fighting over a toy of some kind, what ends up happening is that if one child has the toy and the other child wants it, the parent grabs the toy and then allocates who's allowed to play with it. So we might end up moving that state data up into the parent, and then we pass down that data as props to other elements alongside of callback props in order to say how to modify them. And that then lets both elements interact with our state. So what this means is that when you're trying to find where your state goes, you might need to move it to different components. Don't always put all of your state inside of app. It might feel that way as you get started, but in practice, you really want to think through like which component is the one who should be responsible for this data. Where is it supposed to live? And my song list feels like it should be the person who's responsible for my song array, right? The app doesn't necessarily feel like it should have a song array unless there's a bunch of other things we're doing with that list of songs. Other kinds of data, things like what user is currently logged in, or maybe what's the overall structure is used across lots of pages. That kind of data may better live inside of the app. That's where your state might live, and then you're going to pass that information down as props. That's how you pass down the data, and you'll pass down the components or how to update that data as you'll pass down that the functions of how to edit that work by passing those down as props as well. Okay, so that's the basic idea of forms. Again, the really important points for forms: all forms should be controlled. Give them all inputs are controlled. Give them an on change and a value property so you can be able to keep track of what's set in there. And that when you then want to submit and handle that form, you'll likely need to pass down some state or a prop or a component so that you can then be able to have your form modify and manipulate the state data in some other parent or sibling component.